So far this week, we've been looking at the 17th stanza of Psalm 119, which addresses the connection of God's grace to God's Word. We spoke about how we must recognize the need for God's grace. We must remember that God's Word is always good and beneficial for us, that God's Word gives light to our path, shows us the way that we are to travel in this life. But also we find that redemption is only able to be maintained if we continue to live a life of obedience. But then today, we're going to notice that we must have the right attitude toward sin. David said in verse 133, "Establish my footsteps in your word, and do not let my iniquity or my sin have dominion over me." And then in verse 136 he says, "My eyes shed streams of water because they do not keep your law." Remember, the theme that we're looking at in this section of this psalm is grace. And understanding grace will shape our attitude toward sin. Now, there are many religious people who like to talk about grace, but they really don't understand grace. Many treat grace as though it was a license to commit immorality. We see this established in Jude verse 4. They have the attitude of some in Rome who believed that they could continue in sin so that grace may abound. Romans 6 and verse 1. But you remember the Apostle Paul answered that with the words, "God forbid." No, this is not the way that it's supposed to be. But yet we see those who see God's grace as a permission to sin. But friends, this is a perversion of the grace of God. David here made 2 points about the attitude that God's people should have toward sin. First, he said, "Do not let my iniquity have dominion over me." Friends, we cannot allow ourselves to become enslaved to sin. Sin shall not be master over you, as Paul says in Romans 6 and verse 14. And the way to keep sin from ruling over us is to be established in God's Word. Paul showed the contrast between those who are slaves to sin and those who are obedient from the heart to that form of teaching in Romans 6 and verse 17. After listing the various traits that we must add to our faith in 2 Peter 1 verses 5 through 7, Peter went on to say, "As long as you practice these things, you will never stumble." Then he continued, "Therefore, I will always be ready to remind you of these things, even though you already know them and have been established in the truth which is present with you." Having God's Word firmly planted in their minds would help them to practice what they were taught, which would help them to keep from engaging in sin. If we're to keep sin from having dominion over us, then we must establish our footsteps in God's Word. Secondly, David said, "My eyes shed streams of water because they do not keep your law." Sin should be something that causes us to mourn over our condition. This is what the brethren in Corinth should have been doing regarding the sins that existed among them. Sin is not something that is to be tolerated, it's not to be accepted, and it's not to be celebrated, even with God's grace being extended to us. But yet we live in a world today that teaches us that we are to be tolerant, we're to be accepting, and that goes about celebrating sin. But the Scriptures tell us we are not to do this. We are to have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather we are to reprove them, Ephesians 5 and verse 11. And after listing several sins in his letter to the saints at Rome, the Apostle Paul said, "And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give approval to those who practice them," Romans 1 and verse 32. Approving of sin places us under the same condemnation of those who are committing the sin. We have to have the proper attitude toward sin. It is to be avoided and mourned. But grace, when properly understood, will not allow us to indulge in or celebrate sin. Friends, without God's grace, we are without hope. But without God's Word, we cannot take advantage of His grace. So let us humbly respond to the grace that God has extended by faithfully obeying His Word. Friends, we thank you for joining us for our program today, and have a blessed day.